Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of At Home, the show where I get a chance to talk to everyone else about how this pandemic and life has changed in the last year and what it's like now to figure all of that out. I really need to say that I appreciate every person who's been on the show and shared their perspectives. The last two or three people I've had a chance to interview have all been part of a live Facebook group that a Facebook group that I've been part of since early days of the pandemic. I joined this thing called LIDA. I've mentioned it a few times. It stands for Live Every Day in April, where I was in a private Facebook group, and the whole purpose was to. They started off doing it as live video, but the purpose wasn't just for live. It was really for any type of video content or content creation you do to help you feel more comfortable doing it, sitting here on camera and talking to all of you. And in that community, because it was a private group, I got to meet a lot of really amazing people. And it got me to this point. And the reason I tell you that is the communities that we are around, especially coming through this pandemic, I can speak from personal experience, is the communities I was a part of prior to the pandemic and prior to moving here to the East Bay, looked very different and felt very different than they do now. But the great part about that is relationships you build stay with you for a long time. And that's why I'm so excited to have my guest on today. He and I met a long time ago. Well, being honest, I socially stalked him for a while in the beer industry and the food industry because everything he did just made me happy and feel good. And we finally got to meet and became really good friends. So I am super happy to have Sean Paxton on the show. Sean, how are you doing?
Howdy.
So good
Nice
to
to
have
see
you,
your
man.
face.
Yeah, I'm really glad to have you. We've talked a little bit ahead of time about the show and what this is all about, and you are somebody that I really wanted to have on to talk about everything that people have gone through. You have gone through over the last 9 months, year, feels like 10 years sometimes, because it's such a
Yesterday, what?
yeah, right. It's such a unique perspective, and we'll get into that more in just a minute. But before we do that, why don't I give it over to you to give a quick introduction of yourself, your background, and what you've been doing for the last 9 months.
Wow. Well, thanks for having me on. My name's Sean Z. Paxton. I am known as the Home Brew Chef. I have been a chef for 20, almost 8 years. It's kind of crazy. I cook with beer. I cook with food. I manipulate ingredients and create something abstract from those ingredients. I like to look at nutrition. I like to look at flavors, ethnic cuisines, historical components. I was in a film called Beers of Joy, which kind of went back all the way to when the Mayflower first landed in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and or what is now Plymouth. And I run a website, homebrewchef.com. I've done tons of podcasts, written for tons of magazines, been lots of cookbooks. My website is actually an online cookbook. Made lots of products, and here I am.
Well, thank you so much again for being on the show. And that's, I
Oh,
think, your background and what you've been doing, not just for the last year, but your entire career, I think, is really indicative of, a world that most people, I don't think either are aware of or only ancillarily, that's a word, aware of, because over, the last 10 years or even the last 5 years, cooking at home, you know, using better ingredients, things like that, taking care of ourselves has become much more prominent in at least in the California culture, but I think overall in out there. But in the last 9 months, there's been so much more of 9, 10 months, whatever the pandemic's been going for. There's been so much more of a focus I've noticed on, you know, people eating at home, cooking for themselves, and thinking about what goes into their food. And I think one of the it's kind of silly, but it's also near and dear to my heart is the whole trend of making sourdough and like having a sourdough starter that you can use and make your own bread off of. And this very well because you and I had a lot of conversations over Instagram because I was trying to make a starter and get to the point that I could bake some real bread. And I know it's sort of a joke, generally speaking, because I'll throw the starters away. The pandemic's over. We can go back to the store again and buy regular bread. But I'll tell you, and this kind of leads to a question I wanted to ask is when I started doing the sourdough starter, I had tried it before. I couldn't get it to work, so I let it go. When I stopped home brewing about the time my son was born, because it was so time consuming trying to also be a dad, for me at least, it was just really difficult, and I decided my priorities were someplace else. Going into sourdough felt like home brewing to me because all the science of what was going on with all the little bugs making that starter work so that you could rise this piece of bread and eat it when you were done felt like homebrewing to me. And more importantly than that, it helped me to start realizing how much of an impact what goes into our food has on our bodies. And something I really wanted to start our conversation off with is, in your entire career, but focusing on what we've seen in the last year, how would you say either your clients, people you work with through your website, and the recipes we put out there, how have those relationships and those conversations changed while people have been home so much more and have had to like really focus on what they eat and what they do every day?
Well, you just gave me about 20 different things I could talk about.
You're welcome.
And by the way, the bread that you're making at home is probably better than what you're buying in the store because it's actually properly fermented. So there you go. It's a real fascinating question because we all go grocery shopping. And I think in the last 9, 10 months, we've all experienced where the shelves are somewhat bare. And what we originally went to the grocery store for didn't have it. When you start to think about food security, I think is a good terminology, to think about what you're buying and whether it's a local grocery store, a mass chain grocery store, a Costco, like a warehouse grocery store, um, all the way through to your farmer's market. Like, where are you getting your food? And the food that you're getting, it brings up a lot of really interesting questions because the FDA and the USDA and the guidelines that we've been taught from a nutrition standpoint aren't necessarily correct. And it's also really frustrating because in the last several years, over 10,000 new food additives have been added to our food supply, but only about 20% or about 2,000 of those have actually been tested. And even the testing, who is paying for the testing versus the company trying to sell that ingredient that can be used in a product that can drop your overall food costs to increase the profitability so that these companies can stay in business, not really concerned about your overall health and also the environment.
So glad you brought that up because I part of the inspiration came, at least for me, in retrying out sourdough was seeing some things you posted, and then in combination with also about the same time rewatching the Michael Pullman, I think is his last name, show on Netflix, Cooked, and he does an episode.
Poland. Yeah,
Pullman, thank you. And does an episode on many things, but focuses a lot on bread and fermentation and all of that. And I don't remember the gentleman's name, but there's a person he focuses or he showcases on that episode that's in, I think, Oregon or Washington, that has a bakery, has had it for a long time, and really dives into letting the bread rest overnight, what have you, to really let it. What's that?
Fermentation?
Yeah, exactly, to let it ferment. And I just assumed a sourdough was, the flavor came from something in the yeast. I didn't really have any idea how it was made. But to watch that and to realize that it is actually fermented and that fermentation has there's a very critical reason for doing the fermentation and how it breaks down the nutrients in a way that your body can then actually absorb them properly, makes the bread so much healthier for you because your body can do something with it afterwards, not just like white breads or even regular wheat bread for that matter. And not to go too far down the rabbit hole of bread specifically, but the combination of things of learning about that and then seeing some of the content you had put out there started to get me to realize, and my wife had already been talking about gut health and things like that for a while, and it got us to really kind of stop and rethink how do we want to actually be eating every day, because we're not going to the stores as much, we're using DoorDash constantly. Clearly that's not a great idea, but then we're like, okay, we want to cook more, we have a limited set of things we're cooking, what can we be doing better? And it really, at least for us, it helped us. It took a long time, 6-7 months of playing with that idea to even get to a place where we changed our diet up enough that I think we're doing a lot better today. But in the beginning, at least, it got me thinking more about that. And I just find that fascinating. And you and I had a conversation recently about some of these topics. And I'd love to understand a little bit more from you about, when you talk to your clients or people that are patrons of your website, of the recipes that you put out there, how have these conversations changed recently?
Wow, again. Well, this is where I think it gets really interesting is because you talk about fermentation and we think about one what is fermented, bread obviously, and it's not just the flour, the water, the yeast that makes bread, sometimes salt. And this is where, if you want to make better bread, start with those basic ingredients. Are you using a really good, high quality water that doesn't have, I mean, it's interesting when you look at our groundwater and what the city provides us versus filtered water or reverse osmosis water, but then everything's stripped out of it and removed. And water chemistry, especially when you start to look at brewing and how certain beer styles, the characteristics that make that beer style is based off the water, and that will accentuate hops or the malt or certain other flavors, will affect the fermentation all the way through to the flour itself and what kind of flour it is, looking at ancient grains versus just your standard wheat or all purpose, how much of the bran are you using, to really look at a whole food versus a highly processed food where they've added all these other minerals and vitamins back into it to fortify it to make sure that it meets those standards. And then how does our body process it? Because really, what you're saying, when you look at not just yeast and commercial yeast exclusively, when you start to look at a sourdough, starter, that's where you start to have all the different bacteria. You have to have like a whole really colony, and that colony is breaking down those different starch molecules, converting them into different sugars, and then consuming those sugars. That gives the bread rise, gives the bread flavor, depending if it's some of the lactic acids and the different way, depending on what your starter happens to have. And that's why like sourdough starter is, from San Francisco is different than whether you're in the East Coast or the Midwest, or in another country for that matter, and what's in your local flora. And this is where, I'm really glad to hear you even bring up, fermentation and our health and where we're getting our food and what we're giving our body, because I think we do need to sit and stop and slow down for a second and reevaluate what we are putting into our body. There is a huge change. I mean, we're talking a paradigm shift in how we feed ourselves and our families. Restaurants right now, I have so much sympathy and respect for so many of the chefs and owners of restaurants that, one, are being forced to look at, do they stay open, lose money, but they keep their employees and employed, or to feed the customers, but then not knowing at all who will show up and the raw ingredients that potentially could be wasted. And when you look at adding in to go containers and materials and how those affect the environment and the cost for those, all the way through to where we're really at, because so much of the food that is delivered or is to go really shouldn't be to go, because I'm sorry, French fries from 30 minutes ago in a container, they're just not the same thing. So, and really, are those French fries really good for you? I mean, yes, it's from a potato, but that is a starch, and that starch creates, carbohydrates and glucose, and the oil it's fried in, most likely it's going to be a cheap vegetable oil that's very high in omega 6s that potentially can cause inflammation and cause some of the issues that we're having across the globe right now. uh, it's really interesting when you start to look at the quality of the ingredients that you can buy, whether you don't have to go to Whole Foods or a health food store. You could go to the farmers market, and I've consciously made the choice since I moved to Sonoma to shop and get probably 80 to 85% of my food from a farmer's market, because I actually know all my farmers who produce almost all my food, that I buy, and I eat seasonally. It forces me to eat seasonally. I mean, tell me a grocery store that really swaps out their produce fruit section and really shows that, it's the middle of winter and there's all these berries that are coming from other countries that they're not picked at their optimum
Mm-hmm.
ripeness, and then to really start to look at the bigger picture, the pesticides and the preservatives and the CO2 environments that they're all put in. All this affects the nutrition, all this affects the flavors, and all this affects the textures. And just like a tomato in the middle of or the end of summer versus the middle of winter, it's a very different product. And when you look at fermentation, especially, we're starting to add in other organisms that are breaking down the principal food elements that actually are easier for us to ingest, because it's not just that we put it into our mouth and we chew it and we swallow it down our esophagus and it goes into our stomach, and then our liver adds some enzymes and bile, and how that all goes through our intestines and our small intestine that sucks the bile back out, and here we're left with all that. It's much more than that, because that's just the mechanism. But then when you really think about your biome, I mean, I don't know if people realize this, but you have about 5 to 6, maybe even 7 pounds of organisms that are living in your body. And those organisms are telling you, and actually, this is where depression, uh, your cognitive abilities, your cravings, all the way through how well you sleep, is all based off what
Mm-hmm.
those bacteria in your biome are eating and consuming. And then serotonin and dopamine, guess what? That's what causes those cravings. So you
It,
think about how much sugar, you think about all the
mm-hmm.
carbohydrates, even what the food pyramid has told us. It's a whole, really, it's a rabbit hole. But you really
It's
take a look at how can you clean your diet, and especially being home, to even understand that the more fermented foods that you actually consume that are alive, that will change your biome and actually make your immunity stronger, which can actually help prevent COVID or other such diseases, and not
mhm.
just limit it to a pandemic
Yeah.
disease, so, or
It's
virus.
it's interesting because I've when I hear all you talk about these real effects that what we put into our body has on our body. I know I've been hearing that perspective for a number of years, but there's been stigma is probably not the right word, but there's been a label put on that messaging for a while now that, oh, and I don't want to label anybody or demean anybody, but oh, that's hippie stuff, or that's whatever, insert label here.
It's
And
been there,
as
yep.
you as you say it, it makes me realize that I don't know that many people understand how much of a connection, with the term gut health, probably what that really means. And we could get into that, I'm sure, at length. But the idea of gut health and like what really goes into your body, how much of an effect that has on how you feel every day. And I don't just mean feel physically, but feel emotionally, because this is
Mentally.
one example of it is if dental pain. Here's a really good example. Dental pain. I've had to deal with a lot of it in my life. Little tiny bits of dental pain have such an effect on your entire body. It can make you feel so drained because where the pain is centered it can affect you so much. It makes it hard to think, and I don't mean think like literally, but it makes it hard to like concentrate on things. It makes it hard to want to function. And I use that as an example because if you like me, I have realized in the last year I can't eat candy. If I have even a little bit of candy, like I love black licorice, but if I have even just a little bit of it, my gut feels like crap for hours. And when that happens, I don't want to eat. I feel lethargic. I've actually noticed I start getting uncomfortable. Like even if I try to work out, my body aches more than it did before. And I mean, granted, that's also partially because I'm in my early 40s. But even in general, putting that kind of stuff into my body that is not good for me, I don't feel good after I eat it. I mean, this happened recently with pancakes. My wife was like, "Hey, let's make some pancakes one morning. They were gluten free. Let's try something." My son wanted to eat them. Fun, great. Had a small stack of pancakes, a couple pancakes, no big deal, a little bit of syrup with them. And right afterwards, I felt terrible. My gut hurt. I just felt lethargic. I didn't want to do anything. I started getting a headache. I'm like, what the heck is this? And then I realized later, I'm like, there is so much sugar in what I just shoved into my body with basically nothing else of, benefit to my body at all. They weren't sourdough, nothing. They were just pancakes with sugar on top. It really strikes me that people don't build that connection between what they're putting into their body and how it actually affects you physically and mentally and emotionally every single day, not just on an existential level but practically speaking, like too much sugar from drinking too much soda, too much coffee, eating a couple donuts in the morning. All of that just has an immense effect on what your body can do. When we're young, I'm imagining teenagers, early 20s even, your body can kind of deal with that and you can kind of just push through. But as you get older, even a little older, you can't do that anymore. Your body just does not deal with it the way it used to. And I've got to imagine that, granted, COVID has its own real effects, and the mental effect of being indoors and not around people to be safe has a different set of effects. But you compound that with not eating well and not paying attention to what you're putting in your body just makes it worse.
Well, I think it's actually a lot more than that. You bring up several different valid points when it's not just what you put in your body, but it's also you've been brainwashed. And I hate to break it to you, maybe I am that hippie, but it's really fascinating to me to really stop and look at the marketing. I mean, think about how so many more kids understand who Ronald McDonald is versus whoever the president is at the current point, or even who Jesus is. I mean, it's really kind of bizarre. Look at when you go grocery shopping, look at the level in which the Elmo and Sesame Street-esque characters are basically perfectly eye level for a kid sitting in the cart and that little seat, and where their eyes are and what they can actually reach and where you're reaching, because are you on the top shelf or the bottom shelf?
Mm-hmm.
Or this is where, I've heard this for years and I have a much different perspective on this now, is that, really when you go into most grocery stores, you only really need to do the perimeter. You don't really need to go into the interior, all the aisles of a grocery store. And the reason being is even the food pyramid, we've been taught that we need to have, bread and pasta and grains and juice and fruit and all these different servings of vegetables and starch, and that's a healthy diet. And when you really stop and calculate what that actually comes out to, most likely it's anywhere between 350 and 400 grams of carbohydrates, which is absurd. I mean, absolutely absurd. And then if you are vegetarian or vegan, that's a little different. But if you're a meat eater, a lot of the protein that we eat is actually converted into glucose. And this is where blood sugar, and you start to look at the bigger issue, diabetes, all the way through to heart issues, to digestive issues, uh, all the things that you were talking about, the brain fog. A lot of that's how our body's processing things, and all the different hormones and cholesterol, and what cholesterol actually really does in our body, and how it's a precursor to a lot of our hormones, and how it can be changed into estrogen or testosterone, or all the way through to insulin or cortisol, which is our stress hormone. And all those have a purpose, but this is where the food chemistry and the food science and the people making these different items that are packaged and sterilized so that they can sit on a shelf for a very long period of time, the nutritional value and the nutritional benefit is actually becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. And this is also where, even like fast food, I mean, for $5 you can get 2,000 calories. Now that doesn't mean it's nutritionally dense. That doesn't necessarily mean it's something that you should be consuming on a regular basis, because it is cheap, it is fast, it is convenient. We're missing the point at that point, because we're the only species on this planet that can cook. We're the only species on this planet that truly understands the science behind fermentation. We're the only species that can really go out and farm, and whether it's monoculture or a whole biodiverse farm, it becomes really interesting, because even the soil, like how we're treating the soil with these large farms, I feel very fortunate where I live in Sonoma, that my local farmer, what he drops, once it hits the ground, he doesn't pick it up again. and he does it on purpose. So if he's picking, let's say, tomatoes, and you reach in, and if anybody who's a gardener knows this, you reach in and you grab a tomato, right? You pull it, and some other ones fall off the tree or the bush, and they land on the ground. There was one day I was out there, and he must have had 400-500 pounds of tomatoes on the ground that were perfectly ripe. I mean, I could have made sauce for weeks. I mean, it was crazy how much tomatoes were on the ground. And I looked at him like, dude, really? He's like, I'm not looking at this harvest. I'm looking at my next several harvests after this. And this is where it's a paradigm shift in how you're looking at the soil and the microbial balance and how the nutrients of that soil will affect the fruit or the vegetable growing from that soil and how it goes from there. And the synthetic pesticides, they are one dimensional, and it doesn't necessarily fit into the whole life
Mhm.
cycle and food, circle of nutrients and how it goes back into our bodies and what our bodies are supposed to do with it, and all the pesticides and preservatives and additives that necessarily aren't friendly to our bodies because they're foreign and we really don't understand. I mean, Olestra is a perfect example. Our body doesn't know what to do with it. And it's the same thing with a lot of what's in our society right now because it's all about convenience. It's all about you deserve a break today. You deserve this treat. And
Mhm.
it's this media brainwashing that I really struggle with because when you really distill it down to first principles and you really look at the core value of what we're consuming, there is no money in it. Except for, I mean, because you can have a little plot of land and have a little farm on your own property and then supplement, with what you can buy at the farmer's market. So you should grow some different things. But really, we don't need, I mean, we're in a land of excess. And to really stop and read the nutritional value, to read the ingredients in what a package, I've been blown away. I mean, for the last 2 years, I've really taken a much stronger look at nutrition and flavors and what is really good for us, and to really look at half those packages and I put them right back on the shelf because it's like, that is absurd. I mean, that is almost irresponsible. I look at McDonald's. I feel like they are irresponsible. Like
Mhm.
they are a big part of our societal problems. And
My wife and I have spent more time in the last X number of months doing exactly that. And it's amazing. To your point, packaging, marketing, advertising. And I'm going to use the word. They're all a manipulation, and I don't mean that marketing and advertising are. I'm not putting them down as an industry. The word manipulation, I think,
how
is
about
a.
you?
It's a valid way to describe it. Sometimes that manipulation is done in a very negative way. Other times, marketing is manipulating someone to do something that they wouldn't have thought of to do. But in the case of food specifically, the two things that pop into my mind that you mentioned, one of them is, and as an example of marketing or advertising that is designed to get you to do something that you wouldn't normally do, is the Got Milk campaign. And if most people, especially in my parents' generation, if you say, "Well, yeah, got milk, drink the milk's fine," say, I'm not saying it's bad, but do you realize how much sugar is in milk? And if you're drinking the amount of milk that was typically advertised to drink, like that is an excess amount of sugar. It's like an apple a day. Eating 4 apples a day is good for you because they're fruit. Yeah, but good that it's fruit, but there's a lot of sugar in an apple. I have eaten apples that have made me feel hyper after having it because there's so much. I actually don't eat Honeycrisp anymore. Not that it's a bad apple, but because it made me feel like jittery, like I had two
Wow.
cups of coffee because there's so much sugar involved in it. And I think that the other
This is
part.
where, i- if you take it a step further, so look at the fiber and everything that's in an apple, right? Well, then you juice it and you've
Oh
now
my
taken
gosh,
out all the
yeah,
fiber and now you're into full on fructose and sucrose. And
we don't
then
do juices
you
anymore.
now are
Yeah,
eating not one apple, but you're eating 5 apples to
and
get that 8 ounce, 10 ounce, 12 ounce glass of apple
yeah,
juice.
we
It's the same
do
thing with orange juice.
we
And
do daily shakes. So we do. My wife used to. We don't haven't done it a little bit. We used to do a blended shake every day, but we use like she found a protein powder. There's a vegetarian protein powder, like 20 grams of protein per scoop. So it's very dense protein because she needs as a vegetarian a lot of protein because she doesn't eat meats. So she's got to find it other places, chickpeas, things like that. But we didn't, other than maybe a small amount of banana into it, we didn't add much because we realized that I have friends who, oh, we're gonna go on a juice cleanse or something. Like, you're consuming so much sugar, like you're not actually helping yourself. And that was the other part that you brought up, was the food pyramid. And I think one of the big misinterpretations of the food pyramid, at least in my opinion, not a scientist and not a nutritionist, but the big misinterpretation is that it's an easy button. Just do this and you're good to go. That's it. You're fine. It's like, no, that's not, in my opinion, that's not what it was meant for. If you use this in combination with taking care of your body through fitness of some kind, working out, whatever else, and other healthy choices, this is a guide for you on how to start down the path of eating, putting things in your body that are good for you. But it is not a, I checked these 4 boxes, cool, I'm good to go today, I can go have a candy bar, right? Like, that's not what that is. It's more of a representation of moderation and understanding the beginning stages of how to understand what it is you're putting in your body, because of the effects it will have on you, not just on your weight or the way your aches and pains feel, but how your brain processes information, how you behave on a daily basis. But I think that's been missed because you said it already, which is people have looked for an easy button or didn't know they wanted an easy button until somebody like a McDonald's, not to denigrate them too, I don't want to beat them up too much, but because they're not the only player here. Any other fast food chain, whatever, people wanted an easy button. It's like, no problem, we'll solve that problem for you. Here's cheap food fast. Oh, okay. And I recognize there are people out there who are in financial situations where they feel like that's their only option, and I don't want to like go down that path too far, because I can't empathize, or I can empathize with, but I can't understand that much because I've not been in that position before, so that's a different thing. But overall, fast food and others like it try to make these things so much more appealing to be less expensive and quick and easy. But to your point, in many cases, if not most cases, they're very devoid of the things your body actually needs, that if you just stay on the perimeter of that grocery store or a farmer's market, you could much more quickly get through those foods at about the same cost, if not less.
Well, and even further than that, our society has now come to the point where even you go to the doctor, and guess what? There's a drug for that. There's a cure for that. And if that drug has side effects, there's a cure for that too. And why spend all this money on not only your insurance, but also on all these prescriptions that your doctor keeps recommending to you, where you could just completely avert all of it and actually go right to the source and relook at your diet. And actually, so much of your diet can actually be changed by ultimately what you are doing by putting what foods in your body, and your choices when it comes to how you look at nutrition, how you look at additives and flavorings, all the way through to where we're at today. I mean, it's really fascinating to me because everything's a shortcut. And we talked about marketing and the brainwashing. It's not only the tool, but it's how you use the tool. It's just like cooking. It's like understanding every cuisine has an onion, but it's how you prepare that onion, how you slice or dice or julienne that onion, and then how you cook it or not cook it. And what do why is it in there? What is it adding to the food? I mean, it's such a different perspective, and I've really myself found an interesting parallel that we are in a universe right now where there's tons of options. There's actually probably too many options, and it confuses people because it's not one product. I mean, think about when you walk down a cereal aisle in a grocery store. There's granola, there's Lucky Charms, there's Cocoa Puffs, there's Cheerios, there's shredded wheat, but that shredded wheat has, this flavor and that flavor, and this one has this flavor and that flavor. I mean, even like Christopher Kimball, I thought, did just an amazing job at a lecture I went to many years ago, where when you really stop and look at, what has more calories, a Hershey's Kiss or a teaspoon of ketchup? The ketchup. What has more calories, a Snapple or a Coke? I mean, this is where it doesn't make sense because of how we've been raised, and yet they've manipulated and exploited those things that we think, like when you have a salad at a fast food restaurant versus a burger, that salad, because of that fried chicken that's added on there and that ranch dressing or that buttermilk, whatever, actually has almost twice as many calories as the burger did. And you think you're making a good choice, but actually you're not. And I don't mean to frustrate people or irritate people. It's more being aware and actually stopping for a minute and actually taking some personal responsibility, because ultimately we're all on a diet. Every food that we eat and put into our mouth is part of our diet. And whether that is following these guidelines for an Atkins or a paleo or your keto or you're all the foods or you're vegetarian or you're vegan, I mean, it's all, you can slice and dice it all you want, but we're all in a diet. We all eat food. We all need to eat food. But do we really need to eat 3 meals a day? I mean, who told us, that's not in the 10 commandments, that's not on the 15 commandments. I mean, that's a marketing ploy. I mean, this is where
Yeah.
we used to be nomads and now we're not. And, you look at obesity rates across the country and look at inflammation and you look at heart disease and you look at so many other diseases. And, if you've watched any TV at all, you'll see lots of drug companies promoting all these different drugs with all these different side effects. And you're like, I wonder if I just took something else out of my diet and changed that, because whether you have high cholesterol or high insulin or there's a lot of things that we can do to change. And even this is where I've struggled, because you look at like diabetic and you look at the diabetic.org website, they recommend drugs and then they promote still eating what's making people sick, but yet just less of it. And this is where, when you really look at the big picture, these are huge industries now. And,
Hmm.
you know, I mean, I know during the pandemic, it's actually stopped people. And I'm hoping waking people up about food choices, lifestyles, convenience, you know, f- cooking and preparing, shopping, cleaning up is all part of eating and cuisine. But remember, cooking is also keeping our heritage alive, our nationality, our family traditions, all the way through to we are feeding us and our family or our friends and our roommates. And it's really important to stop and really think about what we're ingesting and how that fuel ultimately is broken down into our bodies, and it does affect how we feel. It does affect how we changes our mood, our mental capabilities, all the way through to not eating at all. Intermittent fasting or fasting is a very interesting, surreal take on excess and not excess, and what do we really need versus what sounds really good and that's what I'm going to make for dinner. So, I mean, it's
Yeah.
such a bigger topic that I think a lot of people should contemplate and take a minute when you're at the store. And preventative, you can actually, if you are on a lot of medications, you probably could change a lot of that. And even I've talked to my doctor about different things, and they don't have to have more than 16 units of nutrition to be a doctor. And I'm sorry, I probably have more than that now. I never went to
Yep.
school. So and this is just being self-taught and curious and having an inquisitive mind and
Hmm.
saying, let's understand this more. And also, this is not what they're teaching. Why are they not teaching this? And also, when you really look at our society and our goals of living longer and being healthy, and but what are we doing to make that happen? And that's not necessarily, well, I got to go run 5 miles or I got to
Yeah.
go do this. I mean, you can lose weight with just changing your diet or how many meals you're having a day, and that's changing your caloric intake. And it's much more complicated
It's more
than just
nuanced.
a simple thing.
It's much more nuanced, and I think as we kind of wind down this episode, I think what you just really touched on there is this is much more nuanced than simply, well, I stopped eating this one thing, or I went ahead and I run more, or I do this. It's like it's about all of those things and about none of those things. It's a much more nuanced thing. There are, if losing weight is your only goal, there are ways to do that. But know that that's the short-term things aren't really going to help you in the long term. And I think it's just as important to think about that from I want to feel better every day. What does feel better every day look like? Maybe losing weight, maybe your body not aching, maybe having more mental energy throughout the day to be able to work or be productive or whatever that looks like for you. And there's ways to do that simply can be changing your diet. So as we kind of wrap up here, if you were to leave everybody with sort of one thought or like concept that you want people to walk away with when it relates to food and their health and how they focus and just these subjects in general, what would that one thing be? I know there's a lot of them, and we probably should do a follow episode or a live stream later on just to wax poetic about this for hours. But if you were to pick one, if you had to pick one,
Wow. Geez.
totally put you on the spot.
The biggest thing is stop for a minute and ask yourself this pretty basic, simple question that the answer is across the board. But are you happy? Are you feeling good? And even when you think you might be feeling good, there might actually be more than that. And to really like extrapolate just real quickly on this question of are you feeling good? What could you do to maybe feel better? And I think especially where we're not having the contact we're used to. I mean, I pity the fool I hug first, outside of my family. And, I think,
it's probably going to be a long, somewhat awkward hug. It probably will be, but that's okay.
But it's okay. There's actually, after 20 seconds, there's actually a serotonin release in a hug. That's actually really important.
We have some friends who live
with breathing and heartbeat and rhythm. And
we have some friends who live down the street from us, neighbors that we've become friends with as a result of this, because they've been just as closely monitoring their own health and safety as we have for other family reasons. And when we have been around them a couple times safely, the wife and that couple specifically said to us, we've known each other now for 9-10 months. We've been friends this long, and we've never hugged each other. Like, we became friends at a time when we couldn't actually give each other a hug when we said hi or what have you. And it didn't even dawn on me until that conversation, like, and I'm a hugger. That's a thing for me. And I'm like, oh wow. Crap, now that's all I can think about.
Well, and this is where it's interesting, is because we've taken out all the social norms, even just to have somebody outside of your family over for dinner. I mean, that's not a normal thing anymore. And, even with the vaccine or vaccines and protocols and change of administrations and everything else, it's an interesting thing because we have had to think differently. And I guess that's what I ultimately am asking people with my question, is to think differently and to question and to really look at every box and package that you buy. And if there is no box and package, ask those questions, and not necessarily from a Portlandia, is this local? But, to look at it even further as far as who are you supporting, because your dollar changes everything. And this is where I feel really comfortable in saying this, and that, I know my food security because I know my farmer, and I give him 40 to 60 bucks every week. And that's a lot of what I eat throughout the week. And I am hardly ever sick. And that's not just because I'm staying at home, but I haven't been sick really in years. And a lot of that's because it's local. It's better than organic. He doesn't even follow the organic standard and guidelines, because even who's on the board for the organic certification process. I mean, why should a farmer have to pay a certification process to make sure that there's no pesticides used, versus the guy next to him who can put whatever he wants on his fields and there's no consequence? I mean, it's completely backwards. So this is where, again, thinking about where your food comes from, how is it labeled, how is it packaged, and what you're consuming. I know that was a real simple answer.
No, it's perfect. And I think it leads to the probably another episode or another conversation at some other point, because this is a nuanced thing. All of these things are very nuanced, but they have a very meaningful impact on people. So, Sean, thank you again so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it. If you want to, where can folks find you?
Well, thank you first for having me. I really appreciate it because this isn't a topic that a lot of people ask intelligent, thoughtful questions that make you quander a little bit more than normal. But I am on all the social media, Home Brew Chef, on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, and I'm also working on a whole new channel that since we've had some time, and I'm working on a video setup as well to talk more in depth on maybe all these questions that you've asked me that I can't all answer at once because time constraints. But at Tomorrow's Cuisine is kind of a whole new website that I'm working on and a whole new concept because I think especially now more than ever, our nutrition and nutritional density is a really important thing to think about, and what we learned from yesterday and today and how we apply it to tomorrow and how we take care of ourselves.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I really appreciate you dropping those. And for everyone watching, all of the links to everything that Sean does at Home Brew Chef, Tomorrow's Cuisine, all those things will be listed in the comments down below. Sean, thank you again. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeff. Good to see your face.
You too. And thank you all again for being on the episode. I really appreciate you showing up each time for these episodes. It's so fun to get to talk to so many different people about so many different things because they all have an impact. All of these have an impact on our lives. And I really hope you'll spend some time looking into the topics that Sean and I talked about today, because I firmly believe that these days, the more time we spend at home and the less time we spend around other people, we really, at least other people in person, not just here over video like this, the more we really need to focus on ourselves and figure out how we can make ourselves feel better. Whatever feeling better means to you. I think it's something that we really need to focus on. I can tell you that I struggle every day with really trying to drink less coffee because I find myself being lethargic in the afternoon, and I know that I have more of my energy in the morning, but I think I can probably solve for that in how I eat, the way I eat. And Sean brought it up. I don't eat 3 meals a day. I eat like 5 or 6 meals a day, but that's something different. Right? They're smaller, they're condensed, they're purposeful. So I think all of that can really contribute to how we feel every day, whether we're productive or not, etc. It just takes a little bit of being intentional, and that's hard. It takes work, but nothing that's worth having is it comes easy. It just doesn't. So again, thank you for joining the show. I appreciate it. Tune in next week. You can hit subscribe down below to get notified of, to keep up with all the content we have, and then hit the little bell icon to get notified when new stuff comes up. Hit like if you like the video, and I'll see you next week on At Home. Have a great one. Bye.